Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast diving deep into nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And I'm Mother Joe Kershaw, and my pronouns are she, her.
In this episode, we'll discuss the 23rd Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 31 or Proper 26, which this year falls on the 5th of November. We have one content notification for this episode. We talk about torture, terrorism, and anti-Catholic discrimination when discussing the deep dive. Also, a reminder for folks, if you haven't yet, please go fill out our survey. It is bit.ly/NAC listeners survey. We want to know what you think as we look at what season 4 will bring, and this is the last week that the survey is going to be open, so this is your last chance. Please help us out and fill out the survey. Thanks!
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So, for our deep dive this week, since Sunday is Guy Fawkes Day, the 5th of November, we are excited to have special guest Mother Joe Kershaw, who is tutor in liturgy at the College of the Resurrection, Murfield, which is a Church of England seminary in Yorkshire, founded by Anglican monks. She was born in Scotland and studied medieval German, writing a doctoral thesis on 13th century mystic Mechthild of Magdeburg before studying for the priesthood. Welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you.
We are so glad to have you with it.
Yeah. So, in the U.S., particularly, I can speak from my own experience, Guy Fawkes Day is V for Vendetta. Remember the 5th of November. So, what are we remembering? What is Guy Fawkes Day?
Well, I mean, there's kind of two answers, if I'm honest.
Sure.
One is it's Bonfire Night. It's an occasion where the British love to let off fireworks, which is, of course, popular in many cultures and for many reasons. Eat various traditional foods. We can get into that a bit later. And build big bonfires on which we often burn a sort of scarecrow figure, which is called a guy. And that brings me to the other aspect. Why is it Guy Fawkes Night? It's a pretty nasty story, actually. And I'm sure we'll get into how this sort of morphs into the V for Vendetta stuff. But this is the commemoration of the foiling of a plot to assassinate the king in 1605, King James I, or King James VI of Scotland, as he was also known, by blowing up the state opening of Parliament. It's got a pretty dark and in many ways actually quite unpleasant history. But the bonfire and the fireworks are a constant. I mean, everyone growing up in the UK knows the story and the history behind it. But it's also, I think, probably not at the forefront of most people's minds. Although, and we'll get into it, with Guy Fawkes has turned into something completely different in popular culture. CV for Vendetta. And I'm excited to dive into that too.
Sure.
And the rhyme, yes, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot. I see no good reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot.
Ooh.
Yeah, I confess, I did not grow up with V for Vendetta. I grew up with hearing about Bonfire Night, mostly in Agatha Christie novels and stories, because it shows up a few times. And so I was familiar with Bonfire Night, and I knew the name Guy Fawkes, but I didn't really know much of the story behind it until later.
Yeah. I was just going to say that also feels like in the realm of the poem, it's like those cliches that we have of like one bad apple, and people forget the rest of the cliche, which is one bad apple spoils the bunch. And that, I was like, as you said it, I was like, oh yeah, but I like that's never part of what I think about. Also, my aunt's birthday was the 5th of November, and so I have like my own 5th of November stuff, right? But
slightly different.
Yeah, but the full rhyme is
a bit more. So who was Guy Fawkes, and when was he? Can you set him in a time in history for us?
So Guy Fawkes is born in York in 1570. He's a Yorkshireman, local boy to me-ish. So latter half of the 16th century, a time of obviously great religious tensions between Protestant and Catholic. At this time, it's difficult to be a Roman Catholic. He had Roman Catholic connections in the family, although he was christened as an Anglican. But his father died. His mum remarries a committed Roman Catholic, and he seems to be brought up as a Roman Catholic. He goes over the continent as a soldier of fortune, which wasn't unusual, but he ends up getting involved with a political conspiracy.
What's a soldier of fortune?
So a soldier of fortune is a mercenary.
Oh, sure. Okay.
He goes and takes service. Yeah, it's an older term for mercenary. It's usually used for people who are sort of slightly higher class. And Guy Fawkes
the elite.
Yeah, well, not quite. He's not super wealthy. He's not noble. But his family had some lands and some money. And he gets on very well in various continental armies. He's a very proficient soldier. He's particularly good with explosives, which becomes relevant. And then he gets involved with a group of very radical English Roman Catholics who are unhappy about the fact that Roman Catholics can't worship openly. There had been a hope that when James VI of Scotland ends up succeeding Elizabeth, who of course dies without any children, that he would be more open to giving Roman Catholics civil rights. I'm not sure why. Everyone seems to have projected a lot of hopes onto James. It's a time of great conflict. The more radical Protestants who think that the Church of England is not reformed enough, who want to take it in a more Calvinist and more Puritan direction, also convince themselves that James is their man because he was brought up in the Church of Scotland. Actually, it turns out that James quite likes Episcopalianism for a variety of reasons, both political and also I think he just liked ceremony and he liked things being done in an elaborate way. He's also really into the theatre.
So he's gay. Sorry.
It has been speculated, although he was...
I was like, this is like the stereotype.
It is the stereotype. I mean, it's been much debated. He had a particularly close male friend, the Duke of Buckingham, but I think he was also...
know it was accurate.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're going to try and fit him into modern categories, I would probably go for bi, because he seems to have genuinely got on well with his wife. They have a number of children. He's a good father by early modern standards.
And this is also the King James who's behind the King James authorized version of the Bible, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So English Catholics aren't happy. However, most of them are trying to get things changed by showing that they're good, loyal citizens and perhaps encouraging Catholic monarchs overseas to do a bit of quiet diplomacy. However, there is a more radical group. There's a plot early on in the reign of James, led by a guy called Lord Cobham and Walter Raleigh, not that Walter Raleigh, who want to remove James and his family and supplant them with his relative Arbella Stuart. They try to get King Philip of Spain to fund them. Turns out that the Spanish monarchs are not actually that keen on opening a can of worms of interfering with other nations' internal arrangements. They don't want to do a coup.
Great way to start a war.
Absolutely. Somebody, it's not clear who denounces them. James, interestingly enough, only executes one of the people involved. It's very close to the start of his reign. First, I think James is not actually keen on killing people for ideological reasons. I mean, he'll do it. He's an early modern monarch. He assumes that's what you do if you're king. But he doesn't enjoy it, which I think is reasonable to his credit.
Yeah.
So he doesn't want to start the reign with a bloodbath. Now, we do know that this plot was denounced by Roman Catholics who knew about it because they're scared of what will happen as a consequence. They think there's going to be a massacre if they're involved in killing the king or his family. And James goes out of his way to make it clear that he's grateful to these people. He doesn't take any action beyond the immediate conspirators, and he pardons a number of the conspirators literally on the scaffold, although the two priests who were involved are executed. So spool forward a bit further. James, in 1604, discovers that the Pope has sent his wife, who has Catholic connections, a rosary. He starts to get a bit paranoid. And interestingly enough, he's particularly paranoid about Jesuits. which is not an uncommon position at the time. The Jesuits are kind of the shock troops of the Counter-Reformation. They're well educated, they're well connected. There's also a sense, and you get this interestingly enough within Catholic circles as well, that nobody quite knows what the Jesuits are up to.
That feels.
I think we still have that, but in a very different sense, because nowadays we sort of associate the Jesuits with left-wing politics and broadly liberal theology.
Exorcisms.
And these Jesuits are not like that.
No.
So James decides that the Catholics are becoming a problem. He orders Jesuits in particular, but also other Catholic priests too, to leave the country. And he reimposes fines on, the term used is recusants. These are Roman Catholics who don't minimally conform to Church of England worship by going along a couple of times a year and receiving communion.
Okay.
So these are quite heavy fines. If you don't go along at all, if you're of moderate means, you end up having to pay 2/3 of your income for the year, which is a lot of money.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Now, there's very spotty evidence for how systematically these were collected. And I think in a lot of places, people just, as long as they, if they were in moderately good terms with their Catholic neighbours, they just let it slide. But the Catholics really did have good reason to be unhappy, and a lot of them felt let down. They'd formed quite a positive impression of James early on, and now they feel, oh no, he's showing his true colours. So a group of conspirators who form around a man called Robert Catesby, or Catesby, I'm never entirely sure how he's supposed to be pronounced, let's go with Catesby, described by sources as a good-looking man, about 6 feet tall, athletic and a good swordsman, who has had a long history of being involved in various plots. I mean, he was even involved in a plot against Queen Elizabeth.
Oh, wow.
She allowed him to live, but fined him 4,000 marks, which is just over £6 million. So getting on...
That's like
a lot of money. That is a big fine. That is serious money. He then goes to Spain. He tries to convince the Spanish king to launch an invasion attempt of England, which he assures him will be supported by English Catholics. This was rubbish. And Philip III is not up for this. He wants peace with England. He doesn't want... And I think he can see it's going to be a disaster. He's not stupid. But Catesby and his friends keep going. Catesby's convinced himself that he can re-establish Catholicism in England. He's had relatives who were priests who were executed. And that's the thing. Elizabeth kills some Catholics for their faith. James doesn't tend to, unless there's evidence that they've been doing politically dodgy things. But Roman Catholic priests who go to England and who get caught are putting themselves at very high risk of being tried and executed. And a lot of these are the relatives. These are English men who have gone over to the continent because they felt a vocation to the priesthood, to the ministry, and are coming back. And these are relatives of the people they're ministering to.
Sure.
So Catesby gathers a number of people. He goes sort of shopping round at the courts of Europe, particularly Spain, trying to get backing for this attempt to murder the king. And they don't actually get anywhere. But he gathers a number of nobles, and they have met Guy Fawkes. They're impressed with his serious commitment to the cause of bringing Roman Catholicism back to England. And Fawkes takes on a false identity of one of the conspirators, Thomas Percy's servants. He starts, for some reason, using the pseudonym John Johnson, which I have to say is a pretty rubbish pseudonym, but hey.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, it's like the psychologist who did developmental psychology and renamed himself Eric Erickson.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
But particularly in Britain, I mean, I guess if you were in a country where there are a lot of Scandinavian immigrants, you might get away with it. But in Britain, I think that is just kind of painting a label and saying, hi, I'm using a false name.
Fair.
They buy a building. They decide that they're going to start tunnelling under the House of Lords. This is incidentally a pretty terrible plot. Their end game is that the king is going to die along with a lot of parliamentarians. So they're going to knock out the elite. And they're going to kidnap James's eldest living child, his daughter, a little girl. She was 9, I think. Yes, 9, that's right. Her name was Elizabeth. Confusingly, the Stuarts weren't very creative with names. And they're going to put her on the throne as a puppet king, as puppet queen rather, and get her to bring back Catholicism. Now, they never get to the point of deciding, because James has 2 boys at this age. They're younger than Elizabeth. Henry, who dies as a young man, and young Charles, who goes on to be Charles I. And they never actually work out what they're going to do with the boys. There's sort of vague comments about, we'll work out what role we give them in the ceremonies of state. And you kind of think you should have thought about this.
Yeah.
Right. Also, I mean, by the laws of the time, wouldn't one of the boys have inherited the crown rather than
we only changed this century the law that makes it the eldest child inherit.
Yeah, and it's not like the Roman Catholics worked differently in that regard. So that's very strange.
So this is basically a pretty rubbish plot.
Okay.
They start tunneling and trying to tunnel their way to the House of Commons. They then start to get worried about, actually, maybe people can hear us. But they manage to hire a building with a cellar that goes under the Houses of Parliament. And although Guy Fawkes was a good engineer in the sense that he knows how to blow stuff up, he doesn't know anything about mining. No one involved in this plot knows anything about mining.
Oh, no.
So they managed to rent a house which has a cellar directly under the House of Lords, and they start storing gunpowder about it. Now, word starts to leak out about this plot. It's not entirely clear how. They have told their priests about it in confession, and there's an unfortunate priest who wasn't involved in the plot called Father Garnet, who overhears the confession, and he's not happy about this, but he feels that he isn't at liberty to share what was said in the confessional, which turns out to be really unfortunate for him. But someone hears about it who starts to get a bit worried, starts to have moral qualms about it, partly because some of the parliamentarians, particularly the House of Lords, actually were Roman Catholics. And he starts to think, hang on a minute. Firstly, we're going to blow up a lot of people who are relatively innocent. And also, we're going to blow up some of our own people. So somebody sends an anonymous letter to Lord Montague, a Roman Catholic, warning that something is going to happen at the opening of Parliament. And please don't tell anyone about this, but you might want to find an excuse to stay home. Montague is not okay with attacks on the king or on the Houses of Parliament. So what he does is he goes to King James and he shows them the letter and says, "Sire, I've had this letter. I'm really worried about it. I think I ought to tell you." And now something sort of slightly odd happens, because the letter doesn't go into any details of the plot, but it uses the phrase "strike a heavy blow." And James's grandfather had been blown up by an exploding cannon. It wasn't an assassination plot, it was an accident. But something about that phrase, heavy blow, makes him think explosions. So he orders that they make a search all around the Houses of Lords, and Guy Fawkes is caught on top of a giant stack of gunpowder.
Oh, goodness.
Practically a smoking gun.
Yep, indeed. And is arrested. This is where the story gets very dark and sort of goes from farce to tragedy, although there are still some quite farcical elements in it, because, as I say, this was not a very well executed plot. Guy Fawkes is a pro.
I just, we did an episode on vengeance earlier, this fall, and part of me is it just feels so incompetently done, and it feels like cishet white, gamer kids who are I'm pissed about this thing, I'm just gonna do the thing, and then it's you don't even know what you're doing, no forethought. Oh gosh.
Yeah, you're right, though. It's strange, though, because these weren't teenagers by and large.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I think Catesby thought he was invincible. He's survived plotting against Queen Elizabeth. I think he thinks he's untouchable.
Which, that piece, okay, I get that. Yeah,
but
sure. And some people don't really mature beyond teenagerhood in some ways anyway. but
out of 13...
Yeah.
Somebody's gotta be
You'd have thought that someone said, hang on a minute, there is no possible way this can end. Well, I mean, particularly given that they've been trying to get the King of Spain as one of the major power brokers buy-in for this, and they basically said, go away, we do not want anything to do with this, we do not want to know. We are not going to back you in any way, shape or form. I mean, I think to a certain extent, there's a certain amount of nihilism comes into it. There are people involved who feel like their life is going nowhere. Someone said...
I mean, that's like a recipe,
Yeah, I mean, one of the conspirators goes back and forth about whether he wants to be involved. His name was Thomas Winter. One of his uncles had been a priest who was martyred. And he says something like, let's give the attempt, and where it faileth, pass no further. Which I think means that he thought that the wheels would come off at an earlier stage, I suspect.
Okay,
like tunneling, and the tunnel collapses.
Yeah,
but it's possible that he's just given up, that he's depressed about the state of the country. He was close to his uncle who has died, but it may be that he just doesn't care anymore.
And I have spoken to a few folks who investigate various types of crime, and the overwhelming comment is that a lot of horrible plots don't come off because it turns out that most people who plan crime are not exactly chess grandmasters to start with. And also, I've heard from various historians that a lot of history can be explained by the truly wild rate of what we would now call fetal alcohol syndrome in history, because we didn't know that not drinking during pregnancy was important.
And the water wasn't safe to drink anyway. So, what can you do? Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly anyone sensible and anyone who actually was a chess grandmaster would have run very far in the opposite direction, or done what Montague did. And if you see something, say something. So Guy Fawkes is arrested. He continues to give his false name, John Johnson. James is told about this and asks to see him. And he's actually, in a way, quite impressed by Guy Fawkes. He's impressed by his bearing, by his physical courage. But Fawkes is tortured, and he holds out for just over a day. They start off with little tortures, and it gets increasingly nasty. And eventually, inevitably, Fawkes breaks. But in a way, it doesn't matter, because the other conspirators have already all panicked and run away from London.
Right.
And it very quickly becomes obvious who's involved.
Because they're all gone.
Yep. They try, a number of them, including Catesby, try to go into hiding, but they're pursued. It's just a mess. They pretend that they're going hunting. But news of the plot spreads. The authorities set extra guards on the city gates. They have to send guards to protect the house of the poor Spanish ambassador, who is completely uninvolved in all this, but he's a representative of a prominent Spanish nation. The London mob gets very, very angry, and they have to send troops out to protect his house. Although I'm happy to say they do manage to keep the mob out of the Spanish embassy. No innocent Spaniards were harmed in this incident. Various arrest warrants are issued. Guy Fawkes initially reveals nothing other than the name of his mother, who was dead by this point, and that he's from Yorkshire, which is a detail I love, incidentally. People from Yorkshire are always very proud to be from Yorkshire and very keen to tell you they're from Yorkshire. Johnson admits that he wants to blow up the King in Parliament, but he continues for quite a long time to maintain his acting alone, even after the torture started, which is one of the reasons why I think the King's impressed by him, because it's quite obvious he couldn't possibly have been acting alone. So, in the end, the conspirators are all rounded up. There is a showdown in a place called Holbeck House, where a number of them are holed up, including Catesby, and some of them, they've still got some gunpowder. They've fled with gunpowder. They got rained on. And for some reason, they take it into their heads that it would be a good idea to... I think this can only be explained by the fact they were exhausted and panicking and doing stupid things. They decide that they're going to dry the gunpowder out in front of the fire.
What?
Yup. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I don't, it's one of those where you just scratch your head thinking what was going on in these people's heads. I mean, they were very wet and very cold and very terrified, and people make bad decisions. But nonetheless, there's bad decisions, and we've got some gunpowder, let's put it in front of the fire to dry.
Yeah.
And there's an explosion in a fire which engulfs Catesby, Rookwood, Grant, and an unfortunate guy called Morgan, who wasn't part of the plot but had got dragged along with the fake hunting party.
Oh, no.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A number of them die. Catesby survives. And the Sheriff of Worcestershire and a company of 200 men
survives.
Their attention being attracted by this massive great explosion and fire, which, As one would be.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Rush the property. Thomas Winter is hit in the shoulder. A number of the conspirators are killed at this point. But a number of other people are arrested. There is a general, what the more sensible moderate Catholics were afraid of, inevitably happens. There are a bunch of people who were arrested who probably weren't involved or were only very marginally involved. The usual suspects.
Is this where the one priest who overheard the
this is where Garnet gets arrested, and the woman who was hiding him, who certainly had nothing to do at all with the plot, gets arrested, although she's eventually released. She continues to claim that she didn't know that Father Gerard was a priest. She says she just knew he was a Catholic gentleman, which is probably rubbish. But on the other hand, what are you going to do in those circumstances?
Sure. And also, if you are a Catholic and a Catholic priest comes to hide, like, I don't know, there's an amount of, like, care and reciprocation for clergy.
Absolutely.
She's like,
absolutely.
Yeah, you're going to hide him.
Yeah, of course you are. Of course you are.
Yeah.
After the initial roundup of people who might be conspirators, there is a more proper investigation. Proper, unfortunately, in this instance includes torture. But they do actually make a decent effort to sort out who is actually involved in the plot. And things happen like James makes a speech to both houses on the 9th of November, where he obviously, as you would expect, condemns the plot as a wicked thing to do. But he also goes out of his way to say that this is just a few Catholics. He's very explicit that most English Catholics were opposed to this. So he does make an effort to say, don't go out and attack your Roman Catholic neighbour.
Okay, but is this like the kind of don't go out and attack that, like, Bush did after 9/11?
No, this is
Muslims, where he was like, don't attack them, but, like, then we're going to do all the Islamophobia.
No, well, it's a bit of both, I think. I mean, but what you have to bear in mind is that this was already a very anti-Catholic society. Sure. And I think James, I mean, he's not hugely happy about having large numbers of Catholics in his realm, but he also is, I think, quite genuinely concerned to protect those who aren't politically active. He hopes he's trying to stop them being Catholic, but he wants to do that through broadly peaceful means. I mean, of course, a Catholic would say, well, having to pay large fines for going to church is not that peaceful. This is not free consent.
Yeah.
No.
And that's true. But I think at the same time, James is sincere about not wanting large-scale persecutions and wanting to limit violence.
Sure.
So we get to the trials. It's very hard to get your head into the space of how this plays out because, I mean, on the one hand, these people have been quite brutally tortured. On the other hand, we get all the apparatus of a fair trial. And charges are dropped against some people where they think they can't prove it in open court. Some people
after
are acquitted.
They're tortured, though.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying this is good from a modern.
I'm saying just making sure.
Yeah, sure. But the interesting thing is that there are still limits, and there is still a sense of concern about not destroying innocent people. There is this sort of weird early modern mentality that testimony is more reliable if it's obtained under torture. Whereas, of course, from even from quite a pragmatic perspective, bracketing morality out of it, we know that's not true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
So it's hard to get your head into. We get this scene where one of the conspirators, most of them maintain their innocence, but one man, Digby, he has a wife and children. I think he is really keen to try to salvage something for them in terms of lands and income, although he fails. His wife's reduced to poverty. So he pleads guilty, asking for mercy for his family and also asking to be executed by the axe rather than the punishment that's meted out to everyone else. We'll get to that in a moment, and it is distressing. He makes a speech saying he's motivated purely by trying to get better conditions for Catholics, blaming James for not keeping his promises, and saying he would never have done this if he hadn't been desperate to improve the condition of his co-religionists. But interestingly, he asks for forgiveness. And some of the people who are in the courtroom cry out, God forgive you, we forgive you. But he's still sentenced to death. And he doesn't get the nice version of the sentence to death either. So everyone who is sentenced to death by what's called hanging, drawing and quartering.
I've heard of that.
Yeah. Now, this is a particularly nasty way to kill someone. So what happens is that normally when a hangman tries to hang someone, they want to break their neck so that they die quickly.
Yeah.
As you know. But in this scenario, the hangman is trying not to break their neck. So they partially strangle them. And then while they're still alive, they cut them down. And then if it's a man, and I have to say it was very unusual as punishment to be meted out to women, then they would castrate them.
Sure.
And then they disembowel them. And then they cut them in 4. And they display parts of their body in different places.
Ooh.
Wow.
Yeah,
and
it's
like somewhere in there they die, but we don't.
Somewhere in there, yeah, exactly. And yeah, no, it is really horrific and really dark. And I mean, what tended to happen is the phrase used, put to death halfway between heaven and earth as unworthy of both. Generally, people who were going to be subjected to this punishment try to jump off the gallows violently in the hope that they'll break their neck. Guy Fawkes succeeded in this. No one else manages it. I mean, some of the Digby, for instance, just goes along with it, tries to die with what dignity he can muster in this circumstance. A guy called Robert Keyes attempts to break his neck and fails. So yeah, it was a really unpleasant end, and that's kind of the end of the plot. In terms of popular reaction, the initial reaction is everyone is very relieved that the plot has been foiled. Absolutely, sure. including a number of Roman Catholics. Of course, they're also very, very depressed because they correctly predict that what will happen is that Parliament will bring through further anti-Catholic legislation. And what happens is that the laws are strengthened. We go back to the full Elizabeth system of fines and restrictions, including what's called a sacramental test. So everyone is required to take communion in the Church of England, which is a problem if you're a Roman Catholic. It's a problem for other people as well. But most of the people it's aimed at, and most of the people it affects at this stage, are Roman Catholics. And that goes on in some form or another for another 200 years. Although a number of important high-status Catholics who are willing to sort of equivocate about what they believe maintain their office during King James's reign. King James, I was about to say there's no witch hunt, which is not true because, of course, James also ends up having a thing about witches. So there was a literal witch hunt.
Sure.
Okay.
And actually, it's interesting, as a side note, a lot of the things that are produced as evidence for people being witches look suspiciously like things a Roman Catholic might do. I mean, not making pacts with Satan, but some of the, they mutter things under their breath as a prayer. And a number of the people who are identified, you can see this in the Pendle witch trials, a lot of the people who are identified as witches are from Roman Catholic families. So there's this weird crossover.
Convenient.
But I mean, Charles doesn't want to go out of his way to investigate Catholics. So there are people, as long as they're willing to do the bare minimum to convince him that, I mean, I'm not saying this is a good liberal policy, but it's interesting that he doesn't go as, despite the fact that James becomes quite a paranoid person, he gets an obsession with plots against his life. You can kind of understand why, to be fair.
I was going to say,
absolutely.
I get it.
It's not paranoia if they're actually out to kill you.
And I mean, you can see it, and he's Macbeth. Primarily, the stuff there is about witches, but it feeds in, I think, to James's general interest in the sort of theme of people wickedly plotting against their rightful king.
Sure.
But yeah, so it was very bad news for Roman Catholics in England. And what happens in terms of celebrating it is that Parliament passes a law called the Observance of 5th November Act 1605, otherwise known as the Thanksgiving Act, which calls for an annual public thanksgiving for the failure of the plot, demanding an annual church service and ringing of bells, and there are supposed to be other observances, which is where sort of bonfires start to come in as a celebration. So everyone was required to go to church and to remain orderly through the service, and the Act of Parliament was supposed to be read as part of the service, which is a strange observance liturgically. We're going to go to church and we're going to read this piece of legislation. I mean, I'm not going to read you the whole thing because it's very long. It does start off by thanking God for his mercy in having true and free profession of the gospel under our most gracious sovereign Lord King James, the most great, learned and religious king that ever reigned therein. Enriched with the most helpful and plentiful progeny. Well, given what happened with his son, I think citation needed, as you would say on Wikipedia. which the many malignant and devilish papist Jesuits and seminary priests, much envying and fearing, conspired horribly. Yeah.
Sure.
And it goes on about
Wait, so were there any actual Jesuits proved to be a part of this?
Yes, well, there were Jesuit priests who were aware of it through the confessional.
Oh, yes, okay.
There is no proof that any of them thought it was a good idea. They probably didn't, I would guess. But as I say, there is huge paranoia about Jesuits.
Sure.
Yeah, is this potentially where there's a shift, right, in confession and stuff? Or like in confidentiality? Where you shift from, if it is a future thing that someone is going to do, then there is more of an obligation to say something, versus if someone's confessing something they already did.
Well, yeah, I mean, as part of it, I mean, you can't, strictly speaking, confess something you haven't done yet. Yeah. And you certainly, despite what Philip Pullman would have you believe, you cannot give someone an absolution in advance. Well, I mean, maybe you can in the world of the magisterium, but the actual Roman Catholic Church frowns on this practice and always has done.
I think the first episode of Daredevil dealt with that one.
It did, yes, that's right. And I mean, I think Daredevil does handle all that side of things quite well. Clearly, they've got someone involved in writing it who knows what they're talking about.
Always refreshing.
Yeah, it's surprising, to be honest. Sort of, So we get this. I think it makes, in terms of practical practice of how you hear a confession, and I think it makes a lot of confessors more alive to what we might have to, the seal of the sacrament, and this is true in the Church of England too. We still have the seal of the confessional, to be very clear that this only applies to things that are actually said while I am hearing your confession, in the sense that you said, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." It does not apply to chat before or afterwards. Yeah. And I mean, for instance, it sort of made people more aware that sometimes you have to say, right, okay, I'm not going to divulge this, but I'm not going to give you absolution unless you go to the authorities, which, they might or might not do. But I think it does make you realise that there were a lot of ways beyond the obvious where a Roman Catholic priest was. And I mean, they might not have confessed to them. That's the thing. Garnet knew, but we don't necessarily know what some of the others had or hadn't heard. Yeah. But saying, well, they didn't confess this to me, they confessed X, Y, or Z, is also breaking the seal of the confessional. And if you're being very...
You can't even admit that you've heard
and if you're being very strict about it, even saying you've heard it is a breach. I think probably these days most people wouldn't take that line. They would say, yes, I heard their confession, but I'm not going to tell you anything that they said because it's covered by the seal. Right. Yeah, so going back to we get this legal obligation to hold these services, which actually remain on the statute books until 1859. Although,
that's a while.
Although interestingly enough, the Act, although it goes into great detail about the horribleness of the crime and the goodness of King James and how you absolutely must do this, it doesn't actually prescribe any penalty for not going or for omitting to hold the service.
Oh, interesting. Sure. Also, I kind of wonder how those later monarchs for those next 250-odd years felt about James being announced as the most religious and wonderful monarch.
Well, I mean, I suppose you can take it as to date.
That's fair.
I don't think he was the most religious king England has ever had. He probably does have a decent case for the most learned to that point. Although Elizabeth in her way would run him close.
James, but she was a woman, so... Yeah,
and also she was his immediate predecessor, and no one really likes... often people don't like praising their immediate predecessor to the skies. It's different if it's... if it was 500 years ago, fine, you can say maybe they were better at Greek than you were. But, I mean, the flattery's being laid on with a trowel, but James was genuinely a very well-educated and academically oriented man. Sure. So... the observance of the church services sort of fizzles out over the centuries. By the time it's repealed in 1859, there were undoubtedly some rubric fascists who were holding these services every year. You certainly wouldn't have got everyone in the parish coming to them, unless they fell on a Sunday, perhaps. But what does remain very, very popular is bonfires, burning Guy Fawkes in effigy.
Sure.
Less popular with Catholics, naturally.
Yeah, understandable.
You can understand.
You'd imagine.
But it gradually morphs away from being a sort of yay King James, boo Catholics, to being yay fireworks.
the innate human need to set things on
indeed.
fire. Absolutely.
There are some exceptions. I mean, there's a town called Lewes in Sussex where they have particular bonfire observances, which still has quite an anti-Catholic flavour, more than it would elsewhere. In Britain, but it's also kind of morphed into a comment on the day. So they burn unpopular politicians in effigy. So Boris Johnson got burned in effigy after the Partygate scandal.
There's a shocker.
And there's a sort of...
Well, and from what I've seen of portrayals of Bonfire Night, I think for our American audience, it's not just a straight bonfire, because usually there are like little fireworks placed inside the bonfire that go off throughout.
Or you may have a sort of organised display at a distance from the fireworks. That's probably more common, I think.
Oh, sure.
And kids get given sparklers. Do you call them sparklers in America? Yeah, good.
Well,
I never know, you see.
No, you're like, you've been throwing in these like turns of phrase that I'm like, oh, that totally makes sense. We've never used that.
Yeah.
So it's fantastic.
But I mean, Bonfire Night becomes a bit odd, actually, because there's... In its origins, it's about celebrating loyalty to Protestant religion and to the British Crown. But it very quickly develops a sort of edge of letting off steam more generally. And a sort of slight element of... I mean, you can see that in Lewis. I mean, yes, they burned the Pope in effigy, I regret to say. I mean, not recently, but they would historically have burned the Pope in effigy. But, you know, they'll also burn Boris Johnson. They'll burn effigy of the Prime Minister. It's sort of...
Very equal opportunity.
But what I'm saying is I think it starts to develop this edge of being just general protest and sort of slight small a anarchism. Okay. And you get...
I mean, I was going to say, I can be on board with the let's not blow people up part of this celebration. Like, that, it kind of reminds me, last summer sometime we had a reading in the lectionary from, I guess it must have been the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus is asked by the disciples, hey, should we set these people on fire? And Jesus says, no, don't set people on fire. And
wrong.
It's one of the very few rare moments when Jesus is actually completely clear in an answer to literally any question.
That's true. I hadn't thought of that. And you get tradition. So in parts of Lancashire and West Yorkshire, so close to where I am now, it was known as Mischief Night, and becomes an evening where the lads just go out and play pranks on their neighbours.
Okay.
That's kind of died out now because it's got sort of rolled into Halloween and trick-or-treating. The 2 days fall quite close together. And in other parts of the UK...
it sounds like...
Yeah, although there wasn't any treat about Mischief Night, unless the treat was you get to mess up your neighbour's garden with relative impunity.
Sure.
And in the 19th century, you start to get people talking about Guy Fawkes as a hero who was trying to campaign for people's freedom and liberty, which he wasn't really. He was trying to campaign for the liberty of Roman Catholics to be Roman Catholics, which in his mind probably went along with liberty of Roman Catholics to stop people being Protestants.
Yeah, so you mentioned some of the ways that people like celebrate and commemorate today. And I think it's interesting, like the fireworks piece, I think is interesting because in the United States, there's a lot more movement and pushing towards not having fireworks.
Yeah.
Or at a minimum, not having noisy fireworks. But both, like, environmentally, not having fireworks is better for the environment, but also the number of people with PTSD or those sorts of things where the loud bangs.
Yeah. I mean, that is a point of debate here. There are, obviously, we too have people with PTSD. I mean, before I came to Merrifield, I was a parish priest, and one of my parishioners was a war veteran. He'd been wounded by an IED in Afghanistan, and although physically, I mean, the guy who was with him was killed. Physically, he got off relatively lightly, but massive psychological trauma. And he finds the whole period around Guy Fawkes very, very difficult, obviously. And people are starting to talk about that a bit. But unfortunately, over the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years, there's also been sort of drive to fireworks becoming bigger and more noisy, which cuts against that. And I noticed last year that some of the supermarkets were selling no bang fireworks, which would be a really good thing. And, you know, they're nice. I mean, I like fireworks, but I'm not a big fan of the loud screeches and noises. I mean, I don't have PTSD, but I still don't like it. And I mean, there are other sensory things, you know, and people's pets. You know, so there are a lot of reasons why a number of people sort of starting to say, hang on a minute, do we really have to have these loud bangs? The no bang fireworks are a great idea. I think they have, you know, the things like Roman candles, which is Rome as in Italy, not Rome as in Roman Catholic, which are just sort of, I think it's important in context to explain.
No, for sure. I could for sure.
Yeah, which are just sort of fountains of sparks. Catherine wheels that don't scream, named after St. Catherine, of course, who was executed on a burning wheel, it's said. So there's sort of three fireworks tied in a triangle on a piece of card, which you nail into something. And if you've nailed them correctly, they have a terrible tendency to stick. But if you've got it right, it goes round and round and round in a circle.
Oh, huh.
Okay. So we have various fireworks with various names, some of which are called things like the Destroyer 300 and are sort of more recent coinage, or the Screaming Eagle. Yeah. But there are some that have some traditional names, like the Catherine Wheel, that are a bit more interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know about those names. That is really interesting.
Yeah, and then there are other traditions, like it's very popular to bake potatoes in the ashes of the bonfire.
That is perfect. Sure. I love baked potatoes, and as we get more into fall right now, I have definitely been on a baked potato kick. So that would be wonderful. Yeah.
And then people like to bring toffees and sweets along. There's a particular kind of toffee called cinder toffee, which you make by tipping bicarbonate of soda into the pan, and then it becomes very bubbly, almost like and also it tends to catch a bit and to have a slightly burnt flavour. It is notorious for removing people's fillings, cinder toffee. So some care is indicated. Yeah. And here in the Pennines, there's a popular kind of dark gingerbread cake that's made with oats and treacle, which is similar to molasses, called parkin, which is really popular.
Interesting. Sure. I have never had cinder toffee or parkin, and I'm more curious about the cinder toffee.
Parkin's great. I'm not personally a fan of cinder toffee, but parkin is fantastic.
Okay. I'm not a huge fan of ginger, so that's why I'm more hesitant around parkin. But
you do have to like ginger. But it is a popular winter and autumn spice, clearly.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, for sure. We've talked about how it's commemorated, but are there people who specifically don't commemorate it, don't participate in bonfires, none of that kind of stuff?
Some Roman Catholics feel it's too close to the bone. Okay. They feel it's too associated with anti-Catholicism. It's not universally true. I mean, a couple of years ago, so we have two big Catholic magazines papers in this country, the Tablet, which is generally the more liberal, and the Catholic Herald, which is generally the more conservative. And a couple of years, the Catholic Herald published an opinion piece saying we should ban Guy Fawkes. It's insensitive to the feelings of Catholics. But actually, a lot of Catholics said, "Don't be ridiculous. It's ancient history. We like fireworks." So it's a mixed.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, you certainly wouldn't get Catholic churches organising parish bonfire night celebrations, whereas you sometimes do get other churches doing that, and then some. Sure. And then it generally falls quite close to Diwali. So often British Hindus don't bother to do bonfire night. They save the fireworks for Diwali.
Okay.
I'll be interested. I've just recently moved to a town where there's a very high Muslim population. I shall be interested to see what our neighbours do. I think that could go either way. Some people just, it's an excuse, it's a fun excuse for a party. And of course, kids learn about it in school. So I think it's a mixed bag, but it is generally very widely celebrated. Nobody that I know of does the Guy Fawkes does the gunpowder plot service, though. Having said that undoubtedly there is some loon out there who's doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So our readings for today are the alternative readings for those who aren't observing All Saints Sunday, which is the case in some denominations, although a lot of Lutherans and I believe a lot of Anglicans will be.
We certainly will be at the college. We'll have All Saints during the week when it falls.
Yeah. But the reason why we're talking about Guy Fawkes is because this Sunday happens to land on November 5th. So technically speaking, all of these people, including Guy Fawkes, were baptized Christians. So technically, they're all included in the list of saints that we are theoretically remembering on All Saints, people who have died in the faith. But, I guess recognizing any of them by name would be a whole different universe of...
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't have a problem with putting poor Father Garrett on there who
Sure.
who basically doesn't do anything wrong and dies for the point of principle of believing in the seal of the confessional. But yeah, I can't imagine anyone. But I think that one has to wait for the second coming to sort that one out.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's fair. Okay, so then we have had a little bit of sneak previews earlier in the episode, but as I mentioned, my primary knowledge at all about Guy Fawkes up until an hour ago was V for Vendetta, which is like a pretty popular, like on November 5th in the US, I have like the exact right nerdiness of community that like I get the memes and I get the stuff and I get the V for Vendetta stuff for Guy Fawkes Day.
Yep.
So what do you think about V for Vendetta or other like ones that I might not know about?
I mean, I think it's really interesting how Guy does become this icon of protest. You get this sort of particular mask, which is, of course, you know, in the film, it's a sort of stereotyped 17th century gentleman. I mean, it draws on depictions of the event in woodcuts, and he's got the moustaches are the way that a military, you know, it reflects the hairstyle of a military man of the time. But it almost... It has, I mean, you get, if you dive into the history, you know it doesn't hold up at all. But it's taken on a life of its own. I mean, there's almost the icon of Guy Fawkes. There's got very little to do with the historical Guy Fawkes. And, you know, you can see, you sort of see people wearing T-shirts saying, Guy Fawkes, the last man to enter Parliament with honest intentions.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, strictly speaking in terms of the law, that probably should get you on a terrorist watch list, but it probably won't. It's historic enough that you can get away with it. And maybe it connects to, you know, it's interesting. Maybe it connects to the way in which Guy Fawkes turns in Mischief Night and the Lewis bonfire into being a bit of a way for people to say things that would otherwise be impossible. Which, of course, in the film, it's very much about actual anarchy and actual revolution. And if you see anti-capitalist demos, there is bound to be someone in the Guy Fawkes mask.
Yeah.
And
and I know there were people who wore them in the 2020 uprising protests.
Now that's interesting.
Racial justice and stuff.
Yeah.
And it is not 100% clear to me whether, like, what exactly was the thought behind it, because there's a certain extent to which, like, the pop culture kind of folklore thing that you're talking about, but also just, like, not having your face be recognizable makes
like
huge
that was
difference.
Just the mask they happen to have.
Indeed, and it's cooler than a bandana, although it is of course easier to claim a bandana is just a bandana.
Also true.
But you're right. It's hard, and it's hard to unpick sort of what's meme and what's serious political commentary that's dressing itself up as a meme. And I guess that's the thing about masks. It gives you a layer of deniability, but the price is no one's quite sure what you mean, which I just find really fascinating.
That's fair.
Yeah,
exactly.
Are you curious about how the Twilight Saga is influenced by Mormon theology?
Or why so many vampires are queer-coded?
Have you sat up at night pondering if the documentary Jesus Camp counts as a horror film?
Or have you ever wondered which slasher icon is which member of the Trinity?
Do you ever get into debates about whether the movies Casper, Ghost, and Candyman can be part of the Ghostbusters expanded universe?
Have you watched most of the Nightmare on Elm Street series before the age of 10?
What? Who does that?
Okay, maybe that one's just me. But if you answered yes to any of the other questions, then we've got the podcast for you.
And if you answered yes to Pace's question.
That too. I'm Pace, and I am the super nerdy horror person who's been a horror fan since well before the age when it was appropriate to watch these movies.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and I am the inevitable queer coding somewhere in every horror movie. And we are the hosts of Horror Nerds at Church, a ridiculously queer podcast hosted by two non-binary trans nerds.
Each season, we follow a horror franchise and a host of other horror and horror-adjacent movies to talk about how they connect to queerness, religion, and theology.
We feature bona fide scary movies like Halloween, The Witch, Candyman, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Suspiria.
We also have non-scary movies or low-stake horror movies like Ghostbusters, The Addams Family, Doctor Strange, and Hocus Pocus.
Our upcoming season, we are covering a galaxy far, far away by looking at the Star Wars and Alien franchises from queer, religious, and horror points of view.
So whether you're a lifelong horror master like me,
or a horror Padawan like me,
we have a place for you at Horror Nerds at Church.
Find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you catch your podcasts.
As we jump into the readings, our first reading for this episode is from Micah chapter 3, verses 5 through 12. Through the prophet, God proclaims what will happen to those who lead God's chosen people astray.
So one of the themes in this passage, I will, like my own disclaimer, it took me multiple times to read this passage and not think of current events. We're recording this about a week and a half before posting it. And so thinking about hospitals in Gaza and the kids and the families that don't have food and the ways that like peace is being declared. So that is like, I was like, I have to make a concerted effort to not have all of my comments about this, but I also like need to name that is the immediate place where my mind went multiple times while I was like trying to prepare for this. But I think like one of the things that does come up in this Micah reading, and Micah is a lot about this in general as a book, but like the idea of false prophets, right? The people who are saying something for the wrong reason, something they don't know to be true or they know to be untrue because that's what gets them paid, that's what makes them the money, that sort of a thing. And I actually thought of the show Travelers, which I've mentioned before, where people from the future have figured out how to pass their consciousness to people in the past. And in some ways, they become false prophets because they are trying to prevent certain things from happening so that they don't have the negative impact they think it'll have in the future. And it's fascinating to me because by doing what they do, then they become false prophets because then that thing that they're trying to prevent doesn't happen. It's a whole lot of time travel stuff too, right? But and then there's new stuff that they have to like prevent, and a whole bunch of.
There's a whole episode of My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic where one of the ponies accidentally does this because there's time travel. She's trying so hard to make sure it doesn't happen, but.
That's adorable, and I think the first reference to My Little Pony that we've had on this show. I love it. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 5 we read, "Thus says the everlasting concerning the prophets who lead my people astray, who cry peace when they have something to eat, but declare war against those who put nothing into their mouths." And in Battlestar Galactica, when they finally get to, probably we could make it habitable planet, they call it New Caprica, which is the planet that they're fleeing from with the Cylons, and settle there, and there's an election thing and Gaius actually is voted into power, but then the Cylons come and take over, and I feel like Gaius does this exact thing, like he is getting fed and he is being taken care of, and so he's like, okay, then it's fine, we're at peace, there's nothing wrong. But then like also simultaneously violence is being done against the humans who are just trying to survive and don't have great working conditions and all of that stuff. So it's a Battlestar Galactica. Yeah.
And then in verse 6 we read, "Therefore it shall be night to you without vision, and darkness to you without revelation. The sun shall go down upon the prophets, and the day shall be black over them." And that will be presumably considerably less helpful to us than it was when it happened in Avatar: The Last Airbender, as they were fighting the Fire Nation at the time, who got their powers from the sun and were considerably weaker than usual for a day, although, of course, the Day of Black Sun also did not work out quite as expected in the end. But, they tried.
Yeah. Our second reading for this episode is 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 9 through 13. The author discusses his work with and relationship to members of the church in Thessalonica. So one of the themes that came out for me in this is the idea of like doing your part, doing your share. And I think there's a way that can be ableist when we don't actually like take into account different abilities and disabilities and what contribution looks like and have more expansive view. But I think and I think that's where Mirabel and Encanto, the movie, really come in beautifully, because in some ways within her family, Mirabel has a disability. She doesn't have the special candle magic power and is looked down on and kind of dismissed, especially by Abuela, as not caring about the house, as like not carrying her share of the work, even though she's like way over functioning. And ultimately, it is precisely Mirabel who saves the house and saves the family and helps them understand that there is something bigger than just like exhausting yourself for the sake of everyone else, and not also sharing in the work together and sharing in that unity and family. Yeah, which I love.
Yeah.
And then in the verses, in verse 12, we read, urging and encouraging you and pleading that you should lead a life worthy of God, who calls you into God's own kingdom and glory. And again, I don't know, I guess the Thessalonians reading today is just like, Emily points out how it can be used harmfully. But the number of people, particularly queer people in the church, who have someone pleading with them to lead a life worthy of God under the assumption that queerness is not a life worthy of God. And I've been listening to Billy Porter's memoir as an audiobook. The memoir is unprotected. It is phenomenal. Billy Porter reads it himself. But like, there is this beautiful navigation of the harm that the church does and has done to Billy, particularly as a kid, but of this like, lead a life worthy of God. You have this gift for singing, but don't use it that way. And I am just constantly amazed by the ways that Billy Porter maintains their own spirituality in the midst of all of that. And like, does not necessarily maintain Christianity and church stuff, but is able to kind of separate from the harm that he receives from the church and the actual relationship with God that she has. And I just love it. Highly recommend.
Yeah. Because I mean, your comments about the potential for harm in this is quite right. But I mean, there's another way entirely you could read leading a life worthy of God. You know, it doesn't have to be about what, you know, about what
not everything is about sex.
But more than that, not a life worthy of God isn't actually about conforming to what other people put on you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess that's where the navigating it comes in, and finding a way to be authentic and wholly the person God made you to be. There's a wonderful British poet, trans man called J. Hume, who's written two books of poetry. The most recent one's called A Vanishing Song, and I'm going blank on the title of the first one. But Jay talks a lot about that, about identity and finding your identity from God as a trans person, which doesn't negate the harm that's been done. Although Jay's not from a Christian background, so it's a slightly different story to Billy Porter's. Right. But I think he talks really beautifully about that.
Yeah. And I think part of what I love, right, is that in the midst of Billy's own wrestling and like navigating all of the complexities and the recurring theme of not being protected, there is this clarity with which like Billy Porter has been leading a life worthy of God. Like the ways that Billy Porter is intentional about the money, about the access and the power and like the impact on other people, even in the midst of a really hard life. Yeah.
Whereas if someone had maybe shared this verse with some of the folks in the Guy Fawkes plot, you know, maybe living a life worthy of God means not blowing people up.
It is worth a try.
So
could share that with a lot of people.
And then in verse 13 we read, we also constantly give thanks to God for this, that when you received the word of God that you heard from us, you accepted it not as a human word, but as what it really is, God's word, which is also at work in you believers. And this is a nice reminder that the Word of God doesn't only come to us through Scripture, although that's one place it comes to us, but also through other people via the Holy Spirit. And this kind of reminds me of how Luke Skywalker in Star Wars learned a lot about being a Jedi just straight up through the Force because, you know, his first mentor died in the first Star Wars movie. And then, of course, his second mentor died in another Star Wars movie. And,
you know, I would have...
You know, actually, I'm a little fuzzy on what happened in the next 30 years, but there might have been another couple of them who died.
I would have certainly been quite cautious about taking Luke Skywalker on as a student, given the way...
Yeah, or being related to him.
That too,
Gracious.
yes.
Yeah.
Just a dangerous person to be around. Nice guy, but... And then our gospel reading for this episode is from Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 12. Jesus discusses how to address Pharisees and scribes, and what we should and shouldn't call ourselves.
So one of the themes in this is title, right? What do we call each other, and what do we call ourselves, and what language do we use? And Kay and I both on this podcast introduce ourselves as Pastor Emily and Pastor Kay, which is intentional because we're not, even when we are in the role, in the very explicit role of pastor, the number of times that people don't use the title, and it is a sign of disrespect, and it is a sign of not recognizing our belonging in that space the way that they might recognize a cishet white guy, for example. But there are so many different ways, like, right? You are Mother Joe. There's rabbis. There's, in the Hunger Games, the victors, the doctor, and even like in Encanto, abuela. Like each of those have different titles and have so much meaning in them. I think I get the push away from proper titles, and also I think there is something to be said for like that space of finding what the meaning is in those titles to be able to like hold that space instead of just automatically disregarding. Yeah.
Also, it's maybe not entirely accidental that the push away from titles tends to happen whenever a group of people with marginalized identities starts to, you know, get those titles. Funny how that works. But...
Total coincidence, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, if we're taking Matthew fairly literally, then really what it is like all of the priests who go by father
or mother
need to stop, and then all the rest of us are fine. Like, and that's a different thing.
Yeah.
Somehow I don't think that is going to happen anytime soon, but...
Or was what Jesus was actually saying.
I mean, for sure it wasn't what Jesus was actually saying. That's fair. But since when has that stopped us?
Well, indeed. I mean, I've heard people sort of complain about priests in the Catholic tradition using father, or if you mean, you know, the Anglo-Catholic tradition, mother, who then, you know, address their minister as minister. It's like you're doing the same thing.
Sure. Yeah. And then diving into the verses, in verse 3, Jesus continues speaking and says, "Therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach." And I am definitely a better coach than a player. Like, I can tell people, not just in a like run faster and you'll win kind of way, which I do fairly frequently when I'm cheering people on. I mean, it's true. If people took my advice, they would win all the time. Run faster than everybody else.
So helpful.
I know. I try. In general, like, I am actually good at tutoring. I'm good at helping other people understand things. And so I was like, actually, like,
sure,
I could coach better than I could play basketball. Like, I knew what I was supposed to do. I just couldn't do it. But I also think about one of my dad's favorite, like, things that he used to say all the time that was like, do as I say, not as I do. And there's just so much truth to that. So many.
And come to think of it, that was one of my dad's favorite things to say about politicians. And then in verse 9, we read, Jesus said, "And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven." And, okay, so like we talked about, this episode is not really about going into depth about the full context behind like this verse and why Jesus said it and what it goes on about and all that. That's not really what we do here. We are here for pop culture connections. But I do like to occasionally pull this verse out as an example when people are talking about cherry picking what we want to follow in the Bible. Because literally no one I've ever known follows this instruction from Jesus. And Jesus actually said this, right? So if we are focusing on the stuff Jesus said. This should be something that matters to us. And yet, not really. And I do kind of wonder if Jesus saying this comes out of the fact that his own parentage was in doubt so often. Like, there are actually little side comments that people make to Jesus in the gospel about his father being uncertain, what with his mother getting pregnant when she did. And that happens a couple of times. And how different would Jesus have been? How different would the church around the world be if instead there had been more of a Mamma Mia approach to Jesus's parentage? And, there are some options. We'll have a party, and does it really? Yeah.
That's fantastic.
And, the idea of Abba existing in ancient Israel is kind of amazing. But.
That's fantastic. Particularly because there are multiple, Pride March signs that say something along the lines of, Jesus had two daddies and he turned out fine.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I love that.
Oh, man, a ancient Israel-Palestinian version of ABBA, now they would win Eurovision in a heartbeat.
Yeah. Wow. Although that is just calling your pop group dad, which...
Yeah.
And now for our most explosive segment. Mimi. Let's make a Muppets musical. So, this is the segment where we pick any of the Bible passages or something we talked about today and cast it as if we were casting a Muppets musical with a character or a token human or a Muppet or some expansive understanding of the concept of Muppet. So, Joe, do you have any Muppets that you've been thinking about? Or token humans?
I keep being haunted by the idea of Guy Fawkes, a Muppet musical, which I think would be horrifically tasteless and really shouldn't be done.
Oh, just skip the torture part,
indeed,
please.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I just have this image of Guy
but
Fawkes
Avenue
as
Q. Yeah.
Yeah, but I have this sort of particular image of Guy Fawkes with his gunpowder as Beaker but evil. Sadly, or possibly it's a relief after that my imagination runs dry on the Guy Fawkes the Muppets musical.
Yeah.
I mean, I was when you said Beaker, I was like, oh, but if you had experiments gone wrong, right? The science lab down in the cellar, and the evil Beaker and evil...
I suppose Bunsen Honeydew would be the engineer trying to figure out how to dig the tunnels, or in that universe.
And I think there is probably potential for Statler and Waldorf offering commentary on, just how terrible this plot is and how do you think this is going to work. But, I think this is... Yeah,
especially when they're trying to dry out the gunpowder by the fire.
Yeah,
I feel like that would also be just this.
So there is a popular British children's TV show called Horrible Histories, where there was a book series as well, but I think actually the TV series is funnier, where they do sketches and particularly songs about events in British history. I'm not sure if they've ever done Guy Fawkes, actually. They have done a lot of, Horrible Histories, the name is the programme. But there's certainly, although you'd have to be quite careful how you did this because it's a BBC show and you don't, not to get banned for traumatising the children. But I do think Horrible Histories, Guy Fawkes has potential. It'll turn out someone's done it now. I should have checked that before I came on the podcast.
Yeah, as I was thinking about this, I admit I was not really thinking about the Bible readings for the Muppets either. Instead, when you started talking about Cinder Toffee, I was, if the Muppets did, maybe instead of a Guy Fawkes episode or a Guy Fawkes movie, they could do a Bonfire
that would
Night
be
episode.
Great.
And the Muppets discovering Cinder Toffee just as the constant running gag in the background of all of them losing teeth or getting stuck to things.
I think that's the way forward.
With the Cinder Toffee.
When I was looking, these are not the most Muppet-friendly readings, I have to say.
It's true.
Yeah,
it's true.
Really, no.
But when we were reading the Thessalonians, I did just have a vision of Kermit looking put upon as he tries to deal with the chaos around him in the Thessalonian church.
Yeah, that's fair. Making his Kermit face. Yeah.
Yeah, that...
It isn't easy being green. Or an apostle.
No. I love that. It isn't easy being green or an apostle. Yeah. I was pretty stuck once you mentioned Avenue Q and Guy Fawkes. I was like, okay, now I'm like, no, this is like an Avenue Q production. Which is like, I don't know those Muppet names, but having seen Avenue Q, I was like, okay, yeah, that tracks a lot.
Those are the adult Muppets. Yeah.
I can't remember any of their names either, but the general concept speaks for itself, I think.
Yeah. I think if we were to cast Micah, though, we would have to have the token human be the prophets leading people astray, and then the, like, Muppets being the ones who don't have something to eat and are needing. Kind of like the majority of the characters in the Muppets Christmas Carol.
I was just thinking Muppets Christmas Carol.
Yeah. Against me. Yeah.
I now want to make Micah Rizzo the Rat, just for fun.
Oh, yes. That would work beautifully. He would have so much fun. Yeah. So, Joe, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
42. No, if I'm allowed to do a truly shameless plug.
Yes, please.
One of my other jobs at the college is to be director of an online program called the MA in Worship and Liturgical Studies. It's an exciting program.
Ooh.
It is distance learning online. Lots of exciting people involved in teaching it. If you're interested in doing a master's degree in the field of worship or liturgy, I think it could be a very good and exciting option, particularly if you're in full-time work. Check us out on the website.
Yeah, and
awesome.
we'll link at...
Fantastic.
I hadn't ever thought of, like, distance learning going to school in the UK.
Yeah,
I like it.
It's a relatively recent program, so we've got a small group of students, but we have an American who's based in the US, we have a student in South Africa, and we have a Swedish Lutheran. So, and we'd be very excited to welcome more international students.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great. Well, Joe, thank you so much for joining us. This was fantastic. I learned so much about something I knew almost nothing about. Blown away.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It has been so much fun being with you.
Yeah. And thank you, our dear listeners, for joining us. Our theme music was by Rachel Meyer-Laughlin, and our Muppets music was by Brenda Boss. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 24th Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and now Blue Sky at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than really probably any amount of explosives, but please don't blow people up. Just bad idea. No.
It's a very bad idea. I think we've all learned that from today.
Yeah.
Yes. Hard agree. Also, let us know on Blue Sky, Facebook, or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax Vobiscum.